In this age of information overload, who but a few Texas writers could possibly need a critique of Roy Bedichek or J. Frank Dobie? The latter has had the largest audience of any Texas writer, but at that it is an audience composed primarily of middle-aged nostalgics, and it will probably not outlive him much more than a generation. The young writer who sets out to write about Texas will do well not to ask himself whom he is writing for. When one figures out the answer to that question, the temptation is to quit wasting money on typewriter ribbons and to spend it instead on pipes and beer. Bedichek's best book was his first, Webb's best book his last. Dobie's, in my opinion, came virtually without warning in 1935 and is called Tongues of the Monte. Oddly enough, for a man considered by his sponsors to be a sort of Tolstoy of the Texas soil, it is a book set entirely in Mexico. Texas is seldom mentioned, and Dobie is the only Texan who appears. It is a frankly fictionalized account of a year Dobie spent wandering in the mountains of northern Mexico, a year he often described as the freest and happiest of his life. In his own bibliography of Southwestern Literature, Dobie refers to the book twice, once under Mexico and once under fiction. J. Frank Dobie is too fond of facts for a fictionist and too fond of stories for a historian. His Tongues of the Monte is a kind of fiction woven almost entirely out of tales, characters, sayings, practices, and traditional lore of Mexico. One finds in Dobie, and in Webb too, a strong uncertainty about the imagination. Both revered it in other writers. Neither was sure how far his own could be trusted. In their apprentice days, they both attempted to write stories for the Western pulps. But the results were not encouraging, and they gave up fiction for fact. The fundamentalist emphasis on literal truth may have had an inescapable hold on them psychologically. Each occasionally casts a longing glance in the direction of the novel, but only in Tongues of the Monte, when Dobie had crossed the great river in fact and in symbol, did one of them give his imagination a really free rein. The analogous book for Webb is, of course, The Great Frontier, in which he crosses the Atlantic and produces a dramatistic, if not a novelistic, history. In truth, I think it may have been that Mr. Dobie was too fond of anecdotes to have made either a good novelist or a good historian. Except in his early books, the anecdote is his basic unit, a unit he grew more and more conditioned to by the weekly newspaper columns he produced without a miss for more than 20 years. At the end of his career, he was virtually incapable of doing justice to any story that could not be told in 3 pages or less, doing justice to it in print, that is. From what one has heard, he was a great raconteur. Unfortunately, great raconteurs, who are also writers, are all too often sloppy when they go to write down the stories they tell so well. At heart, they are usually impatient with the written word, and feel that it is a weak substitute for the human voice. The last sentence of Mr. Dobie's autobiography reads, "It's the despair of a writing man who has known the best of storytellers that he cannot translate their oral savor into print. In their hands it usually is. The labor of typing out a story that could be told effortlessly and pleasantly in appreciative company often wreaks havoc with their prose. I think most readers who sit down and read Mr. Dobie's 20-odd books will discover midway through Coronado's Children, his second, that he was just such a hasty and impatient writer. Despite his frequent, perhaps defensive pronouncements about the noble prose of Mallory, Montaigne, Dr. Johnson, et al., much of his own prose reads as if it had bored him to write it. I say that not to poor-mouth him, for I know that he worked in haste and had severe financial responsibilities to meet. Nonetheless, I think his prose reflects his own ambivalence toward literary activity. He seems to have been plagued by a persistent sense that his books were a reduction of life rather than an amplification of it. When he took over the editorship of the publications of the Texas Folklore Society in 1923, it was left to him to write the notes on contributors, and he included one on himself. J. Frank Dobie, editor of the present volume, was born and reared on a ranch in the Texas border country, and although he is now an instructor in the University of Texas, he will always belong to the range. He could never quite be comfortable with himself for having left the range, yet one suspects that at least as much of him belonged to the library. He left a superb personal library, including a range collection that was probably unexcelled, and despite his many reservations about the literary life, literature was his work. After Tongues of the Monte, my favorite of his books is The Guide to Life and Literature of the Southwest, 1943. It is an excellent bibliography, and also essential Dobie. His terse, opinionated annotations make much better reading than the loose, poorly organized sequence of books on animals, though the latter got him much more acclaim. He refused to copyright the guide. The copyright page reads, "Anyone is welcome to help himself to any of it in any way." A few pages later, at the end of his introduction, he makes what for a bibliographer and scholar is a very curious apology. With something of an apologetic feeling, I confess that I have read in my way most of these books. I should probably have been a wiser and better informed man had I spent more time out with the grasshoppers, horned toads, and coyotes. Dobie never quite shook off the feeling that he ought to apologize for his book learning, a feeling one comes by naturally in the rural Southwest. Even today, in the country and the small towns, bookish interests are apt to be equated with deficient masculinity. But Dobie's ambivalence about the intellectual life relates not to this, but to his feeling for nature. His brief remarks on nature in the guide are repeated with slight variations many times in his books and essays. The ethnologists have taken horse culture, as well as themselves, very seriously. If there were time, I would propound briefly and illustrate lengthily coyote culture, rattlesnake culture, longhorn culture, roadrunner culture, and several other cultures more delightful, sensible, and profitable to a man with his roots deep in the soil of the Southwest than any form of culture derived from Italian operas, Ph.D. theses on New England theology, and galleries of art devised to distort rather than illuminate life. Above all, consult the grasshopper's library. Listen to the owl's hoot for wisdom. Plant bean rows for peace. Studies are merely to perfect nature. The only reality is nature itself. Feeling thus, it is doubtful that Dobie was ever entirely content with his vocation. For all his love of books, he could never be quite sure that so much reading and writing did not constitute a betrayal of nature, or at the least a divorce from her which might entail a loss of natural goodness and natural strength. Despite such fears, his most useful work was often his scholarship. The animal books are, as I have said, repetitious, poorly organized, and for the most part dull. He relies heavily on paraphrase, but he never learned to paraphrase effectively. His biography of Ben Lilly, on the other hand, is an excellent book on a man no one but Dobie could have got to, and the many introductions he contributed to reprints of Western texts are usually perceptive and helpful. His work with folklore is, I think, another matter. Dobie had perhaps too much personality to be a good collector, and in the long run it is his personality, not his knowledge of Southwestern folkways, that saves his books. The most serious objection that can be brought against his work in folklore is that, while he railed against prudery and expurgation, his own collecting was prudish and expurgated. One learns as little about the sexual mores of the cowboy from reading Dobie as one learns from the romantic Western fiction he so detested. Possibly his notebooks and letters, when published, will supply much that his books leave out, for he himself was well aware of the problem and mentions it in the introduction to his first book. Although there were cowboys mean, vicious, vulgar, dishonest, and cheap, even ignorant, they did not fit in. The general run of cowboys could not be and were not ignorant or morally degraded, yet partly on account of the reasons that restrained Thackeray, a full delineation of the cowboy's masculinity, a quality interwoven with morality, is not in this book entered into. A frank and full, that is, a naturalistic delineation of the cowboy, as a man apart from his work, and yet as a natural product of his own soil, remains to be done. It will probably be done only in fiction. Samuel Pepys's have been as rare in the West as in the East. Late in his life, when the reasons that restrained Thackeray must have seemed very remote, Dobie let a couple of well-salted anecdotes about Shanghai Pierce slip through into Cow People. Happily, he was never remiss in applauding others who were frank and full, for when Teddy Blue, a Pepys of a sort, published We Pointed Them North in 1939, Dobie was generous with his praise, and quick to point out that one of the exceptional merits of that fine book is its honest treatment of the cowboy's relations with women. Tongues of the Monte belongs to the literature of the marvelous journey. There is some folklore in it, but it is essentially a search for the real and the good. There are many echoes of its Cervantic model, the strongest being the character of the old guide Inocencio, a slightly more wizened Sancho Panza. At the end, the old man gives Dobie his knife, a fine blade, which he calls the faithful lover, and as they are waiting for the train that will take Dobie away, Inocencio cuts a small vein in his wrist, and with his own blood marks a cross in the palm of Dobie's hand. This sign is more than words, he said. Soy el suyo. I am yours. I stood on the rear platform of the lurching car until a curve cut off view of the station. As long as I looked, I saw a little old man who could be stately, though, and who had muscles that never tired, an enormous straw hat on the ground beside him, making the gesture of the open heart toward me, touching his breast with the fingers of his hand, and then extending his arms and holding them stretched out wide apart. I remember a sentence from some writer of Mexico I had read. Just as all plant life springs from the soil, so from it come also the souls of men. The South Texas that Dobie knew was dominated then as now by very ambitious men, and it is not surprising that he should have had to cross the Rio Grande to find his figure of innocence. I saw Mr. Dobie only twice, once at a literary party in Dallas in 1962, and the second time on a hot street in Austin only a month or two before he died. In Dallas he was a joy to watch, though in Dallas any happy man would be. It was February, but Dobie wore his white suit, and with that, his white hair and his roguish grin, he seemed, amid that somber, wintry company, to project the combined appeal of Buffalo Bill and Dylan Thomas. In 5 minutes he had reduced the matrons to twinkles, giggles, and coos. In Austin, I was walking down Travis Street toward noon of a hot summer day, on my way to visit a bookshop, when I saw Mr. Dobie starting up the hill below me. He had a book in his hand, and had probably just emerged from the shop I was meaning to visit. As he approached, I debated speaking, but the day was broiling. I was carrying my young son, and Mr. Dobie was obviously concentrating on getting up the hill and into the shade. He didn't look up, and I said nothing. But when I crossed the street at the foot of the hill, I saw him at the top, his Stetson pushed back, and his white hair fallen on his brow, resting a moment by a parking meter. Though I did not know him, and at that time did not care for his books, I felt that catch in the heart that always comes when I see that one of the old ones of this land will soon be gone, no more to ride the river nor follow the longhorn cow. Bedachek, Webb, and Dobie. And who else? Are there perhaps neglected classics gathering dust in the southwestern sections of our libraries? I think not. The most impressive Texas book of the 30s is J. Evetts Haley's superb biography of Goodnight. Haley is a well-educated, disciplined historian. He wrote better prose than either Webb or Dobie, and it is a pity he has contracted so virulent a conservatism. In recent years he has become the Captain Queeg of Texas letters. No fiction of interest was produced in Texas before the 50s. Some have tried to make a case for George Sessions Perry, whose contribution boils down to one honest but flat Depression novel, Hold Autumn in Your Hand, 1941, and one slight piece of engaging schmaltz, Walls Rise Up, 1939. The books by Texans that began to appear in the 50s wore a very different stamp from those that had appeared in the 30s and 40s. They wore the stamp of the modern, derivative modern in most cases, but modern nonetheless. One began to meet epigraphs from Rimbaud, William Goyen's The House of Breath, and Faulknerian complexity, William Humphrey's Home from the Hill. What is more important, the balance suddenly shifts from the discursive to the imaginative, from history and quasi-history to fiction and poetry. It is not that the frontier ethos had inhibited reflection. Dobie, Webb, and Bedachek were all reflective men. What it apparently inhibited was the more introspective modes of expression. One may write on the frontier, but one must write about the world that is or was, not about the person one is or the world one might imagine. It may be that World War II had a part in destroying that check, for the generation that developed in its aftermath were committed from the first to introspection, and to a conscious search for models and methods. It was not until the war, apparently, that Texas writers learned they could leave the state without turning to dust at the borders. Dobie and Webb had spent time in England, it is true, but one gets the impression that neither of them were ever really at home northeast of Austin. Humphrey, Goyen, John Graves, John Howard Griffin are all as at home in Europe as they are in Texas. The war and the change of scene seems also to have freed our writers from the frontier conviction that existence is only justified by incessant work. The Texas writers of the 50s are a quiet, unostentatious bunch, and the best of their books, The Ordways, Goodbye to a River, Vassar Miller's Adam's Footprint, are the products of imaginations working leisurely, in neither fury nor haste. In that respect, they throw back to Bedichek. Nowadays, of course, Texas writers are scattered high, wide, and lonesome. The generation of which I am a member has barely got started, yet already a younger generation blossoms beneath our feet. A hastily constructed literary map of the state shows that novelists in veritable swarms have begun to emerge from the small towns. One notes the, to me, extraordinary fact that such communities as Chillicothe, Archer City, Stamford, Clarksville, Floydada, Groesbeck, Alvarado, Abilene, and Dundee have produced novelists and can thus no longer be considered intellectually virgin. Some, of course, probably consider that they have been intellectually raped. But if we assume, as we must, that the writers who have published are merely the top of the iceberg, or let's say the ant-bed, the prospect is little short of terrifying. If these creative writing courses aren't stopped, every town in Texas will have its novelist within a decade, and the novelists will have to follow the lead of the oil man and apply for a depletion allowance. It is sometimes tempting to sit back and take a Mailer-esque glance at the talent in the room, but the minute one draws up a list, the temptation diminishes. Such a list would include Humphrey, Goyen, Graves, Griffin, Vassar Miller, R.G. Vliet, Donald Barthelme, Terry Southern, John Recchi, Aubrey Goodman, Bill Bramer, Walter Clemens, Elroy Bode, June Arnold, Sherry Kafka, Robert Flynn, Mac Thomas, Edwin Shrake, the Texas Observers, who all and wherever they are, or let's say Willie Morris, Ronnie Duggar and Larry King, Al Dulin, William Harrison, Hughes Rudd, Dorothy Yates, Grover Lewis, Tom Horn, Max Crawford, Dave Hickey, and a number of others whose light can be counted on to burst upon the world almost any time. There might be a major talent lurking in that thicket of names, but if so, I am not the one to scare it out. I only hope that a desire to escape the Johnsonian taint doesn't drive too many of the younger writers out of the state before they have had time to become well seeded with local experience. Texas writers are sometimes so anxious to avoid the accusation of provincialism that they will hardly condescend to render the particularities of their own place, though it ought to be clear that literature thrives on particulars. The material is here, and it has barely been touched. If this is truly the era of the absurd, then all the better for the Texas writer. For where else except California can one find a richer mixture of absurdities? Literature has coped fairly well with the physical circumstances of life in Texas, but our emotional experience remains largely unexplored, and therein lie the dramas, poems, and novels. An ideal place to start, it seems to me, is with the relations of the sexes, a subject from which the eyes of Texas have remained too long averted. There are those who feel that I have dealt with the subject exhaustively in my 3 novels, an opinion that speaks poorly for some people's knowledge of life. In the section which follows, I would like to deal with the subject again. Eros in Archer County. Number 4. Sex is still a word to freeze the average Texan's liver, particularly if the Texan is over 40 and his liver not already pickled. The young toss the word around carelessly, but adults do not, for careless use might implicate them in suspect acts or suspect attitudes. The young, of course, are mostly urban now, and they seem to be adapting themselves handily to the promiscuity of the age. At the moment, however, I am not interested in describing or evaluating the sexual attitudes that prevail in present-day Texas. That pleasant task can be better taken up in the novel. What urgently needs to be done is to get down what can still be remembered of the sexual attitudes that prevailed here in the recent and not-so-recent past. As Dobie rightly observed, the frontier produced no peeps. Teddy Blue was frank and funny, but all too succinct. The few pages he devotes to the trail driver's activities with women are the nearest thing to sexual autobiography that we have for the 19th century West, and that we have no more should hardly occasion surprise. There were the reasons that restrained Thackeray, the verbal inhibition that even to this day has lost but little of its power in the rural West. Besides, the 19th century West was without a leisure class, and that made a great difference in its literary production. The novels of Henry James and the fantasies of My Secret Life were alike impossible to it. Life in the West was itself such a strenuous physical adventure that the need for a psychic or sexual adventure may have been diminished. Had the author of My Secret Life lived in the West, he would have gone raving mad with frustration. There just weren't that many women west of the Mississippi, and what there were tended to be rather work-worn, and a discouraging distance apart. Fortunately for the investigator, I think one can assume a certain consistency of attitude in the West from about the time of the Civil War until at least World War I. Those of us whose parents were born in the first decade of this century, and whose grandparents were born in the 60s and 70s of the last century, have usually had abundant opportunity for contact with a 19th century sexual orientation. For the novelist, the principal difficulty is one of language, since the novelist needs not merely knowledge of attitudes, but knowledge of the language, and indeed the tones in which the attitudes are expressed. It is the private speech of one's grandparents and their contemporaries that one would have liked to have heard, what they said to one another in the morning in the kitchen or at night in the bedroom, if indeed they bothered to speak in either place. Without the language and the tones of the private moment, it is impossible to recreate in fiction the emotional realities of the lives one's forebears lived. The novelists who have attempted to write about the 19th century West have one and all come up against this problem of speech, and they have one and all been weakened by it. Their dialogue is usually an unconvincing mixture of the contemporary and the archaic, bad enough when they have two men talking, but really hopeless when they try to render the conversation of men and women. It is this inadequacy of dialogue that makes so much of the fiction of the West seem stilted and not quite believable, even when written by novelists who are competent otherwise. While it is unfortunate that we know so little about what people thought, felt, and said about their bodies and their sexual activities in pioneer Texas, what is really sobering is to reflect that unless someone gets busy, we will have recorded little more of what they thought, felt, and said about those matters in the 30s and 40s. The reasons that restrained Thackeray, and Mr. Dobie also, restrained virtually everyone who wrote about the Southwest prior to the 50s. The reasons that restrained Thackeray, and Mr. Dobie also, restrained virtually everyone who wrote about the Southwest prior to the 50s. It was impossible to write frankly about sexual matters, even in a discursive book, without bringing upon oneself the opprobrium of elderly ladies, to whose opinions the pillars of our communities and a great many of our writers have always deferred. There seems now little reason to allow these well-meaning ladies to be a deterrent to frankness, and I should like to set down, ere memory fades, a few not quite random notes on the sexuality of small-town Texas, as I remember it from the 40s and early 50s. The reader will keep in mind that when I titled this chapter, I did not claim much in the way of territory, just Archer County. I was something of a stay-at-home in my youth and can't vouch for what went on down in Jack County, much less for remote areas like Fort Worth and Dallas. Indeed, I'm not even sure that my observations in Archer County were really thorough, but I'm afraid they will have to suffice. The chances of anyone volunteering to fill me in on what I may have missed are now lamentably slim. My own first brush with small-town restrictions on frankness followed almost immediately upon the realization that sex was something worth being frank about. I was 8 or 9 years old, as I recall, and was climbing a street sign pole. When I started up the pole, I had no purpose in mind but casual exercise. But about the time I got to the top, the flexing activity that pole climbing involves produced what I learned years later was an orgasm. I had not been expecting anything so delightful to happen at the top of that pole, and I hung for a moment in amazement before sliding down. A lady of my acquaintance happened to be standing nearby, so I hurried over and gave her an ecstatic report on the event. My description was probably rather vague, but I was able to pinpoint the area that felt so good, and that was enough for the lady. "Shh," she said, looking apprehensively about. "Just don't tell anybody." But I did tell, of course, and so did my young companions. Where the young were concerned, the verbal restrictions were extremely ineffective, or were, at any rate, for a period of years. Curiously enough, among the youth of my hometown, the pre-pubertal years were the period of greatest verbal license. First graders, for the most part, were a sheltered and inarticulate lot, but by the time one reached the second grade, one's vocabulary was swollen with forbidden words picked up on the farmyard, in the school bus, or on the playground. We knew, of course, that such words were rightly the property of adults, and we were careful to use them only among ourselves. Careless use at home would have meant nothing less than the chain and block, and very few of us ever slipped up. Shit, piss, fuck, and goddamn were in extremely common use among second and third graders during the early 40s, and little girls used them almost as readily as little boys. At that time, the one innocent word in the group was fuck. Toilet training had already placed a strong inhibition on reference to the excretory functions, and most of us had been to Sunday school often enough to realize that we could not expect to go to heaven if we took the Lord's name in vain. The God most of us envisaged was definitely of a prohibitive bent, and was known to have the power to enforce his demands. We were a good deal more afraid of him than we were of our early earthly parents. Only the more heathen among us could say "God damn" without sooner or later glancing nervously at the sky. Shit and piss we used with less hesitation, So far as we knew, they were not particularly offensive to God, and by that time it was a relief to escape the forest of euphemisms that had grown up around the waste products. Visits to one's friends were apt to be a bit chancy, since each household had its own set of permissible euphemisms. Some of the more enlightened and antiseptic families utilized the time-honored mathematical formula of number 1 and number 2, but these were in the minority. Others preferred the onomatopoetic tinkle for pissing. A few admitted wee-wee, but pee and pee-pee were looked upon with disfavor, no doubt because they suggested that the penis was involved. Pot was standard for shitting, doo-doo was considered affected. A few preferred the evocative grunt, while others adopted an alphabetical code and said big T and little t. The safest approach of all was simply to ask for the bathroom, leaving one's hostess in comfortable doubt as to the activity to be pursued therein. Bathrooms, incidentally, were seldom lockable. The young were known to be given to masturbation, a practice lockable doors would surely encourage. Not even surveillance could eliminate it entirely, but it did render it respectably nerve-wracking. Probably the little girls used profanity because it seemed to offer an entree into the boys' world. It took no great intelligence to perceive that in that part of the country the boys' world was the more desirable one. As puberty approached, all but a few die-hard tomboys gave up and resigned themselves to being women, and for the next few years unchaste expressions seldom crossed their lips. If a girl were especially vexed, she might use shit as an exclamation, but only if she were in the company of people by whom she wished to be thought daring. Coarse language became the recognized prerogative of males, and they guarded it zealously. To second and third graders, as I have said, fuck was an innocent word. Few of us had any clear idea what it meant, and we ordinarily used it in its adjectival form. In retrospect, I realized that one of the more stunning verbal slips I ever heard was made by a 9-year-old chum who, at the Sunday dinner table, asked his sister to pass the fucking butter. The adults were too stunned for effective response, and we children merely giggled, not realizing that the word was all that bad. At that tender age, we seldom used or needed to use the vernacular words for the genital organs. Of those, the one subject to the severest prohibition was the word cunt, and I think the prejudice against it was a class prejudice. It was unknown to us as children. Adolescents used it very rarely, and the only time I can recall hearing adults use it was when I was in the camp of some semi-civilized laborers who made their living grubbing mesquite and piling prickly pear, a family so low on the ladder of class that they shared their camp with Mexicans. In Texas, the word was partially rehabilitated by the college youth of the 50s, but its use here is still rather guarded. During the filming of HUD, several prominent citizens of the Panhandle were dismayed to learn that among Californians it occurs quite frequently in light conversation. Cock was in fairly common use in the 40s, but the most popular word for the penis was dick. Cock was most frequently heard in cocksucker. The wide use of the latter as a term of derogation would seem to speak eloquently enough of the area's strong heterosexual bias, but in fact the term cocksucker was used in ways which suggest some ambivalence. Prick was frequently used as a term of insult, whereas cocksucker was more often used joshingly, in moments of high locker-room camaraderie. At such times it came nearer to being a term of affection or comradeship, not an accusation of perversion. Of course, there were times when it was used as an insult, usually about 10 seconds before a fight broke out, but I never heard anyone seriously accuse a person of performing the act which the word suggests. There was, I believe, a tacit understanding that only one's friends could call one a cocksucker without expecting retaliation. Of course, the Code of the West carried with it an extremely strong prohibition against overtly homosexual action, so strong indeed that most of us did not really believe in homosexuality as a physical possibility until we reached college age. I witnessed a good deal of youthful homoerotic exhibitionism, but nothing more clear-cut than that, and I can recall only 2 occasions on which there was group masturbation, both on afternoons when it was too hot to play baseball. A charge of homosexuality directly leveled would have produced a fight instantly. Eat my dick was an unignorable insult and always meant a fight, whereas go fuck yourself was a phrase that one was free to take or leave. It was flung about so frequently that it soon lost most of its force. Motherfucker was in the same category. It was generally bestowed good-humoredly. Few considered incest a real possibility, except perhaps between siblings. Very few of my middle-class companions had siblings who could be induced to experiment with them sexually, but there were always 1 or 2 lower-class families on the literal and psychological edge of the community where such experimentation was less dangerous and more frequent. Before leaving erotic vocabulary to discuss other forms of erotic behavior, I should like to consider what seems to me a dominant characteristic of the sexual life of West Texas, and this is the widespread tendency to confuse the genital with the anal. Inter urinas et feces nascimur, and the general feeling seems to have been that one could never afterward venture into that place without risking a physical and possibly a moral befoulment. Mention sex in West Texas, and someone will be sure to say, "I'm not going to talk about that crap." By far, the commonest local response to my 3 novels has been, "Well, I liked the story, but I wish you'd left out that other crap," the other crap being presumably the sexual description. Sex is clearly and frequently equated with the waste products, and energy given to sex is thought to be energy wasted. Those who appear to believe that sexual fulfillment is more important than material success are generally referred to as trashy people, and books about such people are said to be trashy books. The most widely used terms of contempt are terms which combine an anal product with a suggestion of animality: horse's ass, chicken shit, though of course the less eloquent dispense with even this subtlety and simply say, "you asshole" or "you turd." Scatology is also widely used as a method of sexual intimidation. In its crude form, this generally involves the stupid flinging shit at the smart, for in the small town the person with brains poses a direct threat to the masculinity or femininity of the person without them. Many a smart kid had his face pushed into a commode bowl at one time or another, and not a few have endured analgesic enemas or other rectal horrors. I have a bright friend who grew up in a rural area when outhouses were still in use. By the time he reached the 2nd grade, his intelligence had marked him as dangerous, and on days when he had the temerity to answer questions in class, he would be ganged up on at recess and shoved through one of the holes in the men's outhouse, down into the shit. He was a senior in college when I met him, but he still showed a marked reluctance to answer questions in class. The type of scatological put-down which President Johnson is said to employ from time to time in his dealings with Kennedyites, Ivy Leaguers, and his opponents in the Congress may well have been learned in the hill country schoolyards of his youth. I myself once knew a basketball coach who dressed down his players while sitting on the commode. There are, however, more subtle and more damaging aspects of the anal genital confusion. In the late 40s and early 50s, adults still felt it incumbent upon them to stifle adolescent sexuality if at all possible, and a basic element in their strategy was to equate sex with shit, physical love with filth. Masturbation was filthy, and copulation, a process known to involve not one but two sets of human genitals, could only be filthier still. One might catch a repulsive disease, or produce a repulsive baby whose life would inevitably be dark and squalid. Fortunately, most of us were not overly fastidious as adolescents, and managed to make some sexual progress despite the constant danger of contamination. Some progress, but not much. For the boys, losing one's virginity was an initiatory event, important but not especially pleasurable. Most of the boys in my hometown had accomplished it by the age of 14, 99% of them with the same accommodating girl. After the initiation had been undergone, most of us, convinced we had syphilis at the least, went home determined to rot quietly away, and while waiting for the fevers and the fits, we fell victim to the second element in the adult's strategy, athleticism. High school athletics were not easily seen through. When kept in perspective, of course, there is no reason to see through them. Sport is sport and lots of fun, and there is nothing particularly bad about separating boys and girls in the afternoon and organizing them into teams and seeing to it that they burn off their surplus energies chasing one ball after another. Unfortunately, in most small towns, the perspective soon slips. The adults of the town, and particularly the men, tend to participate vicariously and overzealously in high school athletics, and to make them, in a sense, a form of sexual compensation. Their compensation. This, in time, has its effect on the boys, for it is repeatedly made clear to them that the adults regard them as approvably and sufficiently masculine in proportion to how good they are at chasing the balls. Football is the glory sport. As practiced in the small town, it tends to point the male directly away from the female toward the company of his athletic peers. The female is excluded and further demeaned by being thrown a sop, cheerleading, in which her only function is to applaud the prowess of the male. The most applaudable, of course, is the quarterback, despite the fact that he regularly hunches up behind the center in a somewhat sodomitic pose. Football is the manliest of sports, and better a little symbolic sodomy than a lot of irresponsible fucking. If I exaggerate the extent to which the youth of the small towns were suckered with athletics, I exaggerate only a little. Most of my small-town contemporaries spent their high school years trying desperately to be good athletes, because the attitude of the adults had them quite convinced that their sexual identity depended upon their athletic performance. Some of them shed this conviction rather quickly once they were out of school, but others of them have not shed it yet, and never will. Once in a while, of course, things turn out well. A few years ago, our local 11 won the state 1A championship, and the enraptured citizenry bought a commemorative cannon and set it on the courthouse lawn, a proud reminder and probably the nearest thing to a penis ever to be exhibited in those parts. Despite the argument from filth and the pressures of athleticism, the adults of the town were not really successful in their attempts to stifle adolescent sexuality. The best they could manage, and that with the help of religion, was to make us feel guilty about the whole business. The guilt didn't stop anyone, it just cut into the pleasure. Ironically, what really defeated the adults was their own social symbology, in which at this time the automobile was extremely important. All possible means might be used to deprive teenagers of sex, but it would have been a sin against class to deprive them of cars, and, of course, when they gave us cars, they gave us the means to escape the sexual prohibition. As soon as we got cars, we could join in the great Saturday night sport of pussy hunting, foraging as far afield as Olney, Holiday, and Wichita Falls. The area was heavily hunted, of course, and we seldom ran much to ground, but we had lots of fun and learned a few things in the pursuit. When desperate, there were always animals. I have written elsewhere about this aspect of small-town sexuality, but since that text is somewhat obscure, perhaps I can be forgiven for quoting the relevant passage here. "We could go down to the stock pens," Leroy suggested. "There's a blind heifer down there we could fuck. There's enough of us we could hold her down." The prospect of copulation with a blind heifer excited the younger boys almost to frenzy, but Duane and Sonny, being seniors, gave only tacit approval. They regarded such goings-on without distaste, but were no longer as rabid about animals as they had been. Sensible youths growing up in Thalia soon learned to make do with what there was, and in the course of their adolescence both boys had frequently had recourse to bovine outlets. At that, they were considered over-fastidious by the farm youth of the area, who thought only dandies restricted themselves to cows and heifers. The farm kids did it with cows, mares, sheep, dogs, and whatever else they could catch. There were reports that a boy from Scotland did it with domesticated geese, but no one had ever actually witnessed it. It was common knowledge that the reason boys from the dairy farming communities were reluctant to come out for football was because it put them home too late for milking and caused them to miss regular connection with their milk cows. Many of the town kids were also versatile and resourceful. The only difficulty was that they had access to a smaller and less varied animal population. Even so, one spindly sophomore, whose father sold insurance, had once been surprised in ecstatic union with a roan cocker spaniel, and a degraded youth from the north side of town got so desperate one day that he crawled into a neighbor's pig pen in broad daylight and did it with a sow. "I say a blind heifer beats nothing," Leroy said, and no one actively disagreed with the sentiment. When the book was published, the passage involving the blind heifer was apparently regarded as hyperbole, another of my many unkind cuts against my hometown. It was, however, sober realism. Masturbation excluded, bestiality was the commonest and by far the safest method of obtaining sexual release available to adolescent boys in those days. Indeed, if adults were tolerant of anything sexual, they were tolerant of bestiality, or at least passive toward it. Less onus attached to it than to masturbation, I would say. Incredible though it seems, the belief that masturbation led to blindness and insanity had not quite died out by the 40s, and the campaign against the solitary vice was constant and vigorous. Animals, on the other hand, were exempt from the protection of God and man. and for all concerned a big mark in their favor was that they could not be impregnated. That, come to think of it, was the only mark in their favor. The origins of the anal-genital confusion are not too difficult to understand. That the region would tend to produce a predominantly anal orientation is quite natural. It was, by all accounts, a hard region to settle, and only people with a strong retentive capacity could have hung on there and survived. An emphasis on accumulation was also natural, for the area originally gave very little in the way of natural provender. The summer was a time of almost frantic storing. Vegetables were canned, fruits preserved, and, when cool weather came, pigs and beeves killed and hung up in the smokehouse. We never thought of Mother Nature as a fruitful female who was generous with herself. What one got from her, one earned. From nature, one got no sense of sex as gift, much less a sense that sex was something in which both partners could delight. If one observed cattle, horses, sheep, dogs, or chickens, one got the sense that sex was something aggressive males forced upon more or less reluctant females. That is, of course, the view of sex our parents held, or held at least when they were young. One assumes it was the view our grandparents held, but about all we know about the sexual beliefs of our grandparents is what little can be deduced from the size of their families. Unfortunately, the fact that most of them had large families tells us little about their sex lives. Procreation had a clear social value on the frontier, for strength lay in numbers and children were needed to help with the work. Contraception was primitive or non-existent. There were no media distractions, and the church house was 30 miles away in the nearest town. If women thought of themselves in terms of a sexual role, the role was clearly motherhood. And in one's children came one's pleasure and fulfillment. Sex itself was a privilege for the male, a duty for the female. It is hard indeed to think where the pioneer women would have picked up such a sophisticated notion as that of a sexual role, and isolated and overworked as she was, it is even harder to see what good it would have done her if she had picked it up. Years ago, someone pointed out that Texas is hell on women and horses. He was wrong about horses, for most horses are considered to be valuable and are treated well. He was absolutely right about women, though. The country was simply hell on them, and remained so until fairly recently. The pioneer woman had to cope with deprivation and physical hardship. But I am not sure but what the women who came to maturity in Texas in the 20s and 30s were even worse off. They had to cope not with raw nature, but with a new and difficult concept of womanhood, one for which nothing in their early training had prepared them. They suddenly found themselves expected to be the equals of men, not merely socially and politically, but sexually as well. For a girl whose mother had been a pioneer, that leap would almost always be too great, particularly since in most cases she would by this time have moved to one or another of the small towns and fallen under the sexually crippling influence of small-town fundamentalism. The same saddening story filters down to one from the sons and daughters of women who are now in late middle age. They got along okay with their husbands until they learned they were supposed to have orgasms too, after which there was generally confusion and distress. How is the female to switch in one generation from an orientation which sees the act of love as a duty to one which sees it as a pleasure? It cannot easily be done, and perhaps it cannot be done at all unless the woman has a husband who is sensitive to her. Most West Texas husbands of that generation were notably insensitive to their wives, and I find it difficult to believe that very many of them even wanted to understand their wives' sexual dilemma. Understanding would have increased responsibility, and most of them seemed to feel themselves heavily enough burdened with female demands as it was. As the women learned that they were supposed to have sexual privileges too, the domestic life of the town became more and more uneasy.